Part 2. The Coin. Five minutes later, the officer was striding down a series of corridors inside Citadel Stronghold. One of 3 such strongholds on the planet. And of all of them, this was perhaps the most Spartan in ornamentation and was strictly functional. As he went past, troopers and staff pressed against the wall to allow him and his armed escort passage, whilst making the sign of the Aquila in recognition of his rank. The Citadel facility housed the headquarters of Demeter's Dragoons, a Cadian combined arms force that served as a company of detachments, which was a fancy way of saying they collected units that had been decimated in previous conflicts and were unable to get reinforced by their old companies, resulting in a gathering of experienced but scattered troops, hammered into a new cohesive whole. Therefore, this new whole became a melting pot of experience from multiple artillery brigades, infantry combat platoons, armoured divisions, and logistical support specialists. Heck, there were even some representatives of the Imperial Navy here. Since the days of the infamous Horus heresy, where treason had burned the galaxy and turned the Imperium against itself, it had been decreed that no one military entity should have the means or opportunity for engaging in a campaign scale of treasonous warfare. This was so that if a group should go rogue, they would lack all the elements required to engage in a galactic mutiny. For instance, the Imperial Navy and its battle fleets should never have access to its own armoured divisions or troop battalions. Being the melting pot it was by nature, this particular regiment came dangerously close to crossing that line. If not for the fact that they were so few in number, the officer, whose name was Taylor, knew that their existence would not be allowed to endure. Its commanding officer must be a man of surpassing skill to wield so many diverse units effectively. He had been mightily surprised to find that the man he was about to report to was not a colonel, not a governor militant, not a general, but a major. A mere 2 ranks up the chain of command from himself, he mused. His armed retinue led him up to a pair of reinforced blast doors. A squadron of heavily armed troopers processed their clearance, during which a hooded, pale figure bearing a long ornate golden rod or staff, the tip emblazoned with an imperial eagle, appeared from a dark corner. Taylor felt a chill run up his spine, all the way up to the nape of his neck. Taylor tensed. He knew a Psyker's touch. It was something to be avoided. Madmen, possessing of powers and knowledge that broke their flesh and twisted their mind, but became capable of terrifying things that mortal men could barely imagine in their darkest nightmares. And every guardsman had nightmares, whether they admitted it or not. He felt something crawl through the darkest parts of his mind like a greasy serpent, completely unimpeded by the lieutenant's instinctual reaction to shut down. Then the stooped figure in the cowl nodded, and only then did the troops unseal the blast doors. And as quickly as it had begun, the crawling sensation ceased mercifully, and he was ushered inside, and the blast doors sealed securely behind him. He found himself in a command center bunker of sorts. Multiple open archways that led out of the main chamber seemed to lead into antechambers with holographic screens and displays, some embedded in tables that stood waist height, with servitors tending to the devices discreetly but swiftly. Here and there were staff officers and members of their veteran retinues discussing training operations and defense force rotations. Stepping into the central chamber, he swept the room with his eyes until he saw him. He saw a man, perhaps in his early 40s, sat at a circular hollow table on which was a physical board with a game of regicide in progress. The hologram above recreating that game into a three-dimensional rendering of gameplay as virtual troop movements. The man had an augmetic limb replacing his entire left arm, which was currently outstretched, manipulating one of the game pieces with a graceful precision that told Taylor that he'd had the replacement long enough not only to adapt to it, but to take full advantage of all its capabilities. Taylor smartly swept off his service cap and tucked it formally under one arm, his free hand clutching the data slate containing the transfer orders, and, straight-backed, strode smartly towards his new commanding officer. "Second Lieutenant Daniel Taylor, reporting, sir," he said, stepping to attention with a well-drilled precision. The Major looked up from the game at his new subordinate and reached out for the data slate being offered to him. Taking it in his metallic augmetic fingers, he skimmed it before setting it down next to the game board. Taylor was struck by his eyes. One was a mossy green, dark in pitch, and the other was a lurid purple. He had heard tell that people descended from the fortress world of Cadia before it fell sometimes inherited the purple eyes of the people that dwelled there as a genetic trait. Some said it was a side effect of growing to maturity so close to the Eye of Terror, the gateway to the warp that had been held back by Cadia for 12 full Black Crusades. The 13th had, however, proved too much, even for a planetary defense system whose security and military might had been second only to Holy Terror itself. And hell itself had finally been unleashed into the material realm by Abaddon the Despoiler and the forces of chaos. "Lieutenant, I see you survived your trip into the Citadel without any ill effect. Good for you," said the Major. "I was made to feel right at home, sir." "I doubt that," riposted the Major. Taylor wondered just how much his encounter with the sergeant had been known, or planned, for that matter. The Major gestured with his good arm for his new subordinate to come closer. "Come, Lieutenant. Before me is a puzzle." He pointed at key areas of the game in progress as he continued. Taylor listened as Major Demeter outlined the situation in the small game world as if it were a tactical briefing. Making his observations, he noted that the black pieces were assembled in what could be classified as a classic castling formation, screening their most valuable core units, whilst performing precision attacks of opportunity with their fastest, albeit weakest, pieces from the flanks. The tactic had taken its toll on the attacking white pieces, and they would have to consider a counter-strategy, or be forced to concede the field if their losses grew any higher. "So you see the problem, Lieutenant. Tell me, if you were the commanding officer of this assault, what would your strategy be?" Demeter concluded. Taylor walked around the board. An old trick he had learnt to appreciate early in his career was to try and see things from the opponent's point of view. It was a skill that had served him well, and was undoubtedly a key factor of his continuing survival. He saw the formidable defense lines that had been repeatedly repulsing the attacking white forces. The attackers could not maintain the large-scale attacks they had been mustering up to this point. The black pieces were well dug in, and they knew the terrain well enough to take advantage of it. They could not be taken by surprise. All the while he scrutinized the holotable, he was aware of Demeter's eyes watching him as he circled the board. "The battle is lost unless the white forces breach their defenses. Black has chosen the terrain and forced the enemy to come at them in a place where they have the advantage of position. They have dictated the terms of battle, sir." "Then you would signal a withdrawal?" said Demeter, unblinking. "No. I would assault their fortifications en masse before losses are too steep to mount them anymore." As you have seen, the last 3 assaults have failed. How would a 4th assault at depleted strength succeed, where the other 3 did not? Taylor pointed to the surviving white pieces. The forces are sufficient if employed correctly. May I? And after permission was granted, he grouped the white survivors into a narrow column like a spearhead, targeting the very centre of the screening black wall. Their wall is strong and long, and it cannot be outflanked, he said. But a wall is only an asset to the defenders if the attackers are on the outside of it. He moved the pieces forward, and the simulation reacted to his manipulations, and the holographic display simulated the new incursion. The defenders were reluctant to focus their defence in one place for fear of abandoning or weakening the wall in multiple places. Taylor saw this, and grew a little more confident in his stratagem. We focus our strength into a single fist and drive through. The wall now becomes not their bulwark, but their death trap. Instead of keeping us out, it now seals them in. They will not rally their forces in time, and by the time they do, our forces will be in the walls and be everywhere like a flood. Taylor stepped back from the game board as it played out the stratagem in real time. Sure enough, the black pieces were trying to rapidly reform, but each redoubt was smashed by the concentrated forces of the invading whites. Major Demeter closed his metal fingers and rested the fist on the table. A costly assault. Many lives would be lost in the taking of the wall. Victory, yes. But it is a victory at too high a price. Is it a sacrifice you could ask of your men and expect them to see it through? Men are not pieces on a regicide board, Lieutenant. They very much want to live, however much they love their Emperor and his Imperium. Could you live with such a bitter victory? He said, questioningly. Is this a test, sir? He answered. Demeter smiled for the first time. He answered in a low voice. Lieutenant, you were being tested before ever we even met. You may assume that every day henceforth in my command, you are being tested and measured. The lieutenant took a moment to think. Yes, sir. A guardsman's lot is to accept orders so that a directed battle may be executed, but in my experience the true mark of a soldier is to accept that they are the piece of an overall strategy, but only if the game makes sense. Combat is fluid, sir, and having the ability to adapt in real-time circumstances in the field is invaluable. In brief, sir, having the right man in the right place at the right time, that is the true key to any victory. The Major rounded the table to be face to face with Taylor, his voice still soft but piercing. And are you that right man, Lieutenant Taylor? It depends on the job, sir. I may be the right man on one day and the wrong man on another. Which task I'm best suited for is for you to decide, sir. The Major nodded, as the two men sized each other up. Then Demeter turned and picked up the data slate. Applying his thumbprint to the document, the transfer was finalized. He handed it back to Taylor in his steel grip. Welcome to the CA Dragoons, Lieutenant. Get yourself squared away. I'll have a job for you before too long. Count on it. Dismissed. Taylor returned his cap to his brow and made the sign of the Aquila, turning about face to leave. The great blast doors began to open for him once more. As their slow progress opened, the Major's voice drifted to him, still calm, but perfectly audible over the whine of servos and pistons controlling the ancient door mechanism. A true voice of command. Taylor, our lives and the lives of our men are coins to be spent. And if it must be done for a greater purpose. The Emperor indeed protects, and so must we. Taylor left, the Cadian shock troops saluting him all the way down the narrow corridor as he heard the portal seal once more on the command bunker. He felt oddly chilled by the day's events and their meaning for the rest of his career. Within the bunker, 43-year-old Major Antonius Demeter leant against a table, observing the after-action game report. The purple and green eyes locked on the holographic display representation of the single breach in the wall, and the final scrolling message. White victory. Game over. Play again? Promising, he muttered to himself. Only the servitors heard him.